Hello, my name is Hayden Mitchell, and this is my last video for Intro to Aerospace YouTube video. And the person I chose this time was Ira Eaker. A little bit of early years of Ira Eaker. He was born on April 13th in 1896 in Field Creek, Texas, and his father was Graham Eaker, and his mother's name was Young Yancey. He was the oldest of five boys in his family, and in 1916, after moving a little bit around Texas, they ended up moving to southern Oklahoma. All the way up through the 12th grade, he was in public school, and then he went to a teacher school at the time, which is now known as Oklahoma State, and then ended up entering the U.S. Army in 1917. His start in the Army Air Service, he was at a parade, marching in a parade with the Army, and the Army Air Service happened to be there and walked up to a guy that had the plane broken down and saw a wire hanging out of a spark plug, and they couldn't figure out why the engine wouldn't start or why the engine wouldn't run right. And he ended up putting the wire back on with the guy, and the plane fired up and ran great. And this man handed him a card and said, fill this out and send it in, and you should be able to start flying in the air service soon. Pretty much, I think it was 2 days after that, in March of 1918, he was sent to Kelly Field in San Antonio to do his flight training. After his flight training, he ended up and was sent to Rockwell Field in California. And this is where he met two of his lifelong friends, which were not at the time colonels and majors, but were Colonel Hap Arnold and Major Tui Spots. These three men together, we'll find out a little later on, did amazing things in aviation in the start of the aviation, especially in the military aspect of things, but they did many things together that were absolutely amazing, which is why they're all three very, I will say, well known in certain places in aviation. And then in July of 1919, he was appointed to the commander of the 2nd Aero Squadron, and then he was deployed for 2 years to the Philippines. When he got back from the Philippines, he was put in charge of the 3rd Aero Squadron, and he was put at Mitchell Airfield in New York. There he attended Columbia Law School, and then ended up spending 3 years being mentored by Major Patrick, which was the chief of the Air Service at the time, anticipation to be taking over the Air Service. And then in World War II, after this is kind of a big gap here, and we'll fill it in a second, but he ended up working for the U.S., being in charge of the air service, as well as working for Allied forces on the British side, doing many different things. He had many achievements and is a very interesting man when it comes to working during World War II. Here's some other amazing accomplishments that him and back to where Spots comes back in here. Ira and his co-pilot were they were the only ones to complete the full 23,000-mile Pan-American Goodwill flight in 1926. It had 243 cities that they stopped in, and it went from San Antonio all the way around the world and ended up back in DC, which is an amazing flight. And there was actually a crew that died while trying to complete this flight. So it was amazing that Eaker was able to, him and his co-pilot were able to complete this. And then in 1929, him and Spots, actually, and I cannot pronounce the name, Quesada, maybe. They took off with Eaker in 1929 in a tri-motored plane that was named the Question Mark, and they flew for 150 hours, 40 minutes, and 15 seconds, which was the longest endured flight that had ever happened at the time, which was very impressive. And the record stood there for a long time before being broken again. And they actually refueled from a C-1, lowering a hose down out of the back, and then they would gravity feed the fuel into the tri-motor plane, which was a very interesting way of doing it at the time. And then on June 2nd, 1936, with a kind of an inspector, Eaker actually took off and completed the first transcontinental flight that was completely under the hood. They had 8 stops along the way, and they were completely under hood the whole way, which was a pretty big accomplishment at the time. And this is all while he is still is in charge of all of his stuff in the Army Air Service, and uh, starting to work, ramping up going into World War II. And then in his later years, he did not step down from working at all. He worked every single day until the day he died. But after his retirement in 47, he worked for Hughes Aircraft Company for 10 years and then decided to step down from that. And in 57, he became a corporate director for Douglas Aircraft Company, which is a very popular aircraft company, was then at least. And then he ended up, after being with them, following his dream of becoming a journalist, and he continued his writings on from there, and then sadly passed on August 6th of 1987, and he's now buried at Arlington Cemetery in DC. I'm just going to leave this up here for a second, but you can pause the video and see these. This is just a few of some of the things that he was awarded, which is absolutely amazing. One that I think is very interesting: as a U.S. Army Air Service general, he was called the Knight of the British Empire, because he worked so closely with them during World War II. And then here are my resources. But I would highly encourage you, especially the book down in the bottom, The Air Force Spoken Here, is an amazing book about General Ira Eaker. And it is a very, very, he's a very interesting person for a pioneer of aviation.